I still remember the first time I pulled up the long, winding driveway to the manor. The grandeur of it took my breath away, its towering columns and manicured lawns a stark contrast to the modest life I had lived since Harold passed. It was an autumn morning, the kind where the air was crisp and the leaves crunched underfoot, and I had to steady myself before stepping out of the car. I was nervous, no, terrified. My hands trembled as I adjusted my scarf, and my heart pounded with a mix of excitement and dread. This was my first job since Harold's death, and the thought of caring for a young man with such profound needs was daunting. I had worked as a carer before, but this felt different. Bigger. More complicated. As I approached the front door, it swung open, and a man stepped out. His presence was commanding, almost overwhelming, and I instantly knew who he was, Mr. Victor Renault, the father of the young man I'd been hired to care for. He was tall, his salt and pepper hair perfectly groomed, and he wore a tailored suit that screamed wealth and authority. "Barbara Fletcher?" he asked, his deep voice cutting through the morning air. "Yes," I said quickly, my voice trembling as I extended a hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you." He didn't shake my hand but gave me a curt nod instead, his dark eyes assessing me. "Thank you for coming. My son, Daniel, is waiting inside. Follow me." The manor's interior was just as grand as the exterior, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers. I tried not to gape, but it was hard not to feel small in such a place. As we walked, Victor spoke in clipped tones, outlining Daniel's routine and medical needs. I tried to focus on his words, but my nerves kept getting the better of me. "Daniel has cerebral palsy," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He requires assistance with nearly everything: feeding, dressing, mobility. He can't speak, but he understands far more than people assume. Treat him with respect, and you'll get along fine." "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We reached Daniel's room, and Victor opened the door. Inside, a young man in his early 20s sat in a wheelchair, his head tilted slightly as he looked out the window. He turned when we entered, his eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Daniel," Victor said, his tone softening ever so slightly. "This is Barbara. She'll be looking after you." Daniel's gaze shifted to me, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. There was something about him, something vulnerable yet strong, that immediately drew me in. I stepped forward, forcing a smile. "Hello, Daniel," I said gently. "It's very nice to meet you." As the day went on, I worked to settle into my role. Daniel was sweet, his bright eyes full of intelligence and warmth, and though he couldn't speak, he had a way of communicating that was surprisingly clear. He laughed when I told him stories about my late husband's gardening mishaps, and I found myself smiling more than I had in years. Victor, on the other hand, was a puzzle. He remained distant, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I told myself it was just his way of ensuring I was capable, but there were moments when I caught his gaze lingering on me, and I couldn't decipher what it meant. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but content. As I gathered my things to leave, Victor appeared in the doorway, his presence as imposing as ever. "You did well today," he said, his tone begrudgingly approving. "Thank you," I said, clutching my bag tightly. "Daniel is a wonderful young man." His expression softened slightly at the mention of his son. "He is," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, he added, "It can't be easy for you, though. Caring for someone like Daniel." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "It's not about easy or hard," I said finally. "It's about doing what needs to be done. And making sure he feels valued." Something flickered in his eyes then, something I couldn't quite place. "That's a rare perspective," he said, his voice quieter now. "Most people don't see it that way." As I drove home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about Victor. There was a sadness in him, a weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders, and it stayed with me long after I left the manor. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just another employer, but deep down, I knew I had felt something. A spark. A connection. And it terrified me. The next few weeks at the manor settled into a routine. Each day, I arrived early to help Daniel with his morning care and stayed until the late afternoon, ensuring his needs were met. He grew more comfortable with me, his bright eyes lighting up whenever I walked into the room. It didn't take long for me to feel a deep affection for him, not just as a carer, but as someone who saw the remarkable person behind his disability. Victor, however, remained an enigma. He rarely stayed in the room while I worked with Daniel, instead hovering in the background or disappearing into his expansive study. When we did cross paths, his demeanor was polite but distant, though I couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long during our brief exchanges. One chilly Friday afternoon, as I helped Daniel adjust his position in his wheelchair, Victor appeared in the doorway. He was dressed casually for once, dark jeans and a sweater that made him look younger than his years, and there was an uncharacteristic softness in his expression. "Barbara," he said, clearing his throat. "May I speak with you for a moment?" I felt a pang of nervousness as I turned to face him. "Of course," I said, glancing at Daniel. "Just let me." "It's fine," Victor interrupted. "It can wait until you've finished." He left as quickly as he had appeared, leaving me with a strange knot in my stomach. I tried to focus on Daniel, but my mind kept drifting to Victor's unexpected request. What could he possibly want to talk about? After settling Daniel with a book and ensuring he was comfortable, I made my way to the study. The door was slightly ajar, and I knocked softly before stepping inside. Victor was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, staring out at the sprawling gardens. When he turned to face me, his expression was serious, but not unkind. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit. I wanted to express my gratitude. "For what?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "For the way you've been with Daniel," he said, his voice steady. "You brought something into his life that I haven't seen in a long time." Joy. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "He's a remarkable young man," I said softly. "It's an honor to care for him." Victor nodded, his gaze dropping for a moment before meeting mine again. "My wife, Evelyn, isn't as involved with Daniel as she used to be. She travels a great deal, and when she's here, her focus tends to be elsewhere. It's been difficult." There was a rawness in his tone that caught me off guard, and I suddenly felt the urge to comfort him. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I can't imagine how hard that must be." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It is what it is," he said. "But having you here has made a difference. And I want you to know how much I appreciate that." The conversation could have ended there, but he hesitated, his eyes lingering on me. "I was wondering," he said finally, "if you'd join us for dinner tomorrow evening. Nothing formal, just you, me, and Daniel. It's been a while since he's had a proper family meal, and I think he'd enjoy it." I blinked, caught off guard. "That's very kind of you, but I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be," he said quickly. "In fact, I think your presence would make it better." There was a sincerity in his voice that made it impossible to refuse. "All right," I said after a moment. "Thank you. I'd be honored." The following evening, I arrived at the manor feeling more nervous than I had on my first day. I wore a simple navy dress and a strand of pearls Harold had given me on our anniversary, hoping it was appropriate for the occasion. When Victor opened the door, his gaze lingered on me for a moment before he smiled. "You look lovely," he said, his tone warm. "Thank you," I said, my cheeks warming. "You've been very kind to invite me." "It's the least I could do," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The dinner was surprisingly relaxed. Victor had prepared the meal himself, a simple roast chicken with vegetables, and Daniel seemed to enjoy the informality of it all. He laughed as I told stories about my late husband's mishaps in the garden, and Victor chimed in with anecdotes about Daniel's childhood, his voice filled with a rare tenderness. At one point, as I reached across the table to refill Daniel's glass, my hand brushed against Victor's. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I glanced at him, and for a fleeting moment, our eyes met, something unspoken passing between us. After dinner, Victor walked me to my car. The night air was crisp, and the stars shone brightly overhead. We stood by the driver's side door, the silence between us charged with an energy I didn't understand. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. It meant a lot to Daniel. And to me. "It was a lovely evening," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for inviting me." His gaze lingered on mine, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more. But then he stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Barbara." "Good night," I whispered, my heart pounding as I watched him walk back toward the house. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the dinner. About the way Victor's eyes had softened when he spoke to me, about the warmth in his voice, and about the strange, undeniable connection I had felt. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was changing. And it terrified me. The dinner lingered in my mind for days. I found myself replaying every moment, Daniel's laughter, Victor's quiet attentiveness, the fleeting brush of our hands. It was as though I had stepped into a story I wasn't sure I belonged in, and I couldn't decide whether to savor it or run from it. When I returned to the manor for my next shift, everything felt charged with a new kind of energy. Victor was in the kitchen when I arrived, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up with a smile that made my chest tighten. "Good morning, Barbara," he said warmly. "You're early." "I didn't want to be late," I replied, fidgeting with the strap of my bag. "Daniel has his therapy session this afternoon, and I wanted to make sure we were prepared." He nodded, setting his mug down. "You're good at what you do. Daniel seems more alive since you've been here." The compliment caught me off guard, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "That's kind of you to say," I murmured. "But he's the remarkable one." Victor tilted his head, his gaze thoughtful. "Maybe. But I think you brought out something in him that's been missing for a long time." That day, as I worked with Daniel, I found myself glancing toward the door, half expecting Victor to appear. He didn't, but his presence lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow, impossible to ignore. I scolded myself for letting him occupy so much of my thoughts. He was my employer, and I had no right to think of him in any other way. But no matter how much I tried to push the feelings aside, they kept creeping back, growing stronger with each passing day. A week later, Victor invited me to join him and Daniel for a day trip to a nearby park. "Daniel's been cooped up too long," he explained. "I thought some fresh air might do him good. And I'd feel better if you were there." The invitation felt both casual and significant, and I hesitated before accepting. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I wouldn't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be," he said firmly. "We'd like you to come." The park was beautiful, its sprawling green fields dotted with flowers in full bloom. Daniel seemed delighted by the outing, his eyes bright as he watched children playing and dogs bounding across the grass. Victor pushed his wheelchair while I walked beside them, the three of us falling into an easy rhythm. At one point, Victor paused by a bench and gestured for me to sit. "Let's take a break," he said, his tone light. As we sat together, Daniel occupied with a nearby squirrel, Victor turned to me. "You're good with him," he said, his voice soft. "Better than anyone I've ever hired." I smiled, brushing a stray hair from my face. "It's not hard to care about him. He's wonderful." Victor nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. "He is. But it hasn't been easy. After his mother started traveling more, it felt like everything fell on me. I tried to give him everything he needed, but," he trailed off, his voice heavy with regret. "You've done more than most people would," I said gently. "And it's clear he loves you." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "Sometimes I feel like I failed him. Like I wasn't enough." The vulnerability in his tone broke something open in me, and without thinking, I reached for his hand. "You're more than enough, Victor. He's lucky to have you." The contact sent a jolt through both of us, and for a moment, we just sat there, the world around us fading into the background. His hand was warm and steady, and when he didn't pull away, my heart began to race. "Thank you," he said softly, his gaze lingering on mine. "That means more than you know." The moment was broken by Daniel's laughter as the squirrel darted up a tree, and I quickly withdrew my hand, my cheeks burning. Victor seemed unfazed, but there was something in his expression, a quiet intensity, that stayed with me long after we left the park. That evening, as I sat alone in my modest home, I couldn't stop thinking about the day. About the way Victor had looked at me, about the warmth of his hand in mine, about the strange, undeniable connection growing between us. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something that scared me as much as it thrilled me. I told myself I was being foolish, that I was reading too much into his kindness. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. And I didn't know how to stop it. The growing connection between Victor and me felt like a thread I couldn't stop pulling, even though I knew it could unravel everything. I told myself it was nothing, just fleeting moments of kindness between two people navigating difficult circumstances. But every time our eyes met or his hand brushed mine, the truth became harder to ignore. A few days after the park outing, Victor asked me to stay late. "I have a meeting that might run late," he explained. "I'd feel better knowing Daniel has someone here." "Of course," I said quickly, though the thought of staying longer made my nerves buzz. I didn't trust myself around Victor, not with these feelings I couldn't control. The evening passed quietly. Daniel and I worked on a puzzle together, his bright laughter filling the room as I fumbled with the pieces. By the time I tucked him into bed, the house had grown dark, and I debated whether to wait for Victor or leave a note. But as I turned toward the door, I heard his voice. "Barbara." I froze, my heart pounding as he stepped into the room. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, and there was a weariness in his expression that made him look more human, more vulnerable. "You're still here," he said softly. "You asked me to stay," I replied, my voice trembling. "I was just about to leave." He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine. "Thank you. For everything you've done for Daniel. And for me." "You don't have to thank me," I said, my cheeks warming. "It's my job." "It's more than that," he said, his tone filled with something I couldn't quite place. "You brought life back into this house. Into him. Into me." The words hung in the air, and I felt the weight of them pressing down on me. I wanted to dismiss them, to pretend they didn't mean what I thought they did. But the look in his eyes told me otherwise. "Victor," I began, but he stepped closer, his expression a mix of hesitation and resolve. "Tell me if I'm wrong," he said softly. "Tell me if I've misread this. And I'll never bring it up again." My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with unspoken words. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't say anything," he said, closing the distance between us. His hand reached for mine, his touch sending a shiver through me. The kiss was tentative at first, as though we were both testing the waters of something we couldn't take back. His lips were warm, his touch gentle, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. It wasn't just passion, it was something deeper, something that felt like finding a missing piece of myself. But as the kiss deepened, so did the guilt. I pulled away, my chest heaving as reality crashed over me. "We can't," I said, my voice breaking. "This isn't right." Victor's expression was filled with both longing and regret. "I know," he said softly. "But it doesn't change how I feel." Tears stung my eyes as I shook my head. "I need to go," I said, turning toward the door. "Please don't follow me." The drive home was a blur of tears and trembling hands. I couldn't believe what had just happened, couldn't reconcile the feeling swirling inside me with the person I thought I was. Victor was married, my employer, and yet I couldn't deny what had passed between us. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I replayed the moment over and over. The warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. It terrified me. And it thrilled me. The next morning, I expected things to be different, for the weight of what had happened to hang heavy in the air. But when I arrived at the manor, Victor greeted me with the same calm composure as always, his tone professional, his expression unreadable. It was both a relief and a disappointment. I told myself it was for the best, that whatever had sparked between us was a mistake that couldn't happen again. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. As I worked with Daniel that day, I found myself glancing toward the door, half hoping Victor would appear. He didn't, but the tension between us lingered, unspoken but undeniable. That evening, as I gathered my things to leave, Victor appeared in the hallway. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Barbara," he said finally, his voice low. "I don't regret it." I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I didn't regret it either. But I couldn't say that, not without opening the door to something I wasn't sure I could handle. "I'll see you tomorrow," I said instead, my voice trembling as I turned away. But as I walked out of the manor, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The days following that night were torturous. I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss, how tender and deliberate it had been, and the way Victor's eyes seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. I told myself to move on, to keep things professional, but my resolve wavered every time I stepped into the manor. Victor wasn't making it easier. He didn't push or pressure me, but his presence was impossible to ignore. When we crossed paths, his gaze lingered just a moment too long, and his tone softened when he spoke to me. It was as though he was waiting, giving me the space to process, but silently hoping I'd come to him. One afternoon, as I worked with Daniel on his stretching exercises, I felt Victor's eyes on me. He was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching quietly. Daniel laughed as I made a silly face to distract him from the discomfort of the stretch, and Victor's expression softened. "You have a gift with him," he said, stepping into the room. I straightened, brushing my hands on my slacks. "He makes it easy," I said, smiling at Daniel. Victor moved closer, his presence filling the space. "It's more than that. You see him, not just his needs, but who he is. Not many people do." His words warmed me, but they also unsettled me. "He deserves that," I said softly, avoiding his gaze. "Everyone does." Victor was quiet for a moment, and when I finally looked at him, his eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name, gratitude, longing, maybe even admiration. "You're remarkable, Barbara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but the weight of his words, and what they implied, left me speechless. I turned back to Daniel, focusing on finishing the session, though my hands trembled as I worked. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave, Victor caught me by the door. "Wait," he said, his tone firm but gentle. I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Victor, we shouldn't." "Just let me say this," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I know this is complicated. I know what we're risking. But I can't pretend this isn't real. Can you?" His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "It doesn't matter what's real," I said, my voice trembling. "What matters is what's right." He nodded slowly, his expression filled with both understanding and frustration. "You're right," he said. "But that doesn't change how I feel." Neither of us moved for a moment, the air between us charged with all the things we couldn't say. Finally, I turned and walked out the door, my chest tight with emotions I didn't know how to handle. That night, I sat alone in my modest living room, staring at the photo of Harold on the mantel. "What am I doing?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't even recognize myself anymore." But as much as I tried to push Victor out of my mind, I couldn't deny the pull he had on me. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, seen, valued, wanted. And though the guilt gnawed at me, there was a part of me that couldn't let go. The breaking point came a week later. Victor asked me to meet him in his study after Daniel had gone to bed. I knew I should decline, but something compelled me to go. When I stepped into the room, he was standing by the window, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of the desk lamp. "Barbara," he said, turning to face me. His expression was serious, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that made my heart ache. "I can't keep doing this," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "The looks, the words, it's too much." "I know," he said softly. "And I don't want to make this harder for you. But I can't stop how I feel. And I don't think you can either." Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. "This isn't just about us, Victor. You have a wife. Daniel depends on me. There's too much at stake. And yet, here we are," he said, stepping closer. "Because this isn't something we can ignore." His words broke something open in me, and before I could think better of it, I found myself reaching for him. The kiss was different this time, deeper, more urgent, as though we were both surrendering to something we had tried too hard to deny. That night, as we lay tangled in each other's arms, the weight of what we had done pressed down on me. I knew the consequences of our actions, the pain it would cause, but in that moment, all I could feel was the warmth of his presence and the way he made me feel alive again. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I know," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "But I don't regret it." "Do you?" I hesitated, my chest tightening. "No," I admitted. "But I'm scared." "So am I," he said, pulling me closer. "But we'll face it together." The morning came too quickly, and as I dressed quietly, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I couldn't undo the night, couldn't take back the choices I had made. But as I looked at Victor, still sleeping peacefully, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I couldn't turn away from it. The morning after that night felt surreal. The air was thick with the weight of what Victor and I had done, and as I drove home from the manor, I couldn't shake the mix of emotions swirling inside me. Guilt, longing, and fear clashed with a strange sense of exhilaration, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. But reality hit me the moment I stepped into my small home. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of tea I'd made but couldn't bring myself to drink. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What happens now? How do we keep this from unraveling everything? And most of all, what about Evelyn? When I returned to the manor the next day, the atmosphere between Victor and me was taut, charged with unspoken words. He greeted me in the kitchen, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the storm beneath. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice steady. "Good morning," I replied, my own voice trembling. I busied myself with preparing Daniel's breakfast, avoiding Victor's gaze as I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He leaned against the counter, his presence impossible to ignore. "Barbara," he said after a long pause, his tone low. "About last night." "We can't talk about it," I interrupted, my hands tightening around the edge of the counter. "Not here. Not now." His jaw tightened, and he nodded. "I understand. But we need to talk eventually." "Eventually," I agreed, though the word felt hollow. Throughout the day, I focused on Daniel, pouring all my energy into making him laugh, distracting myself from the turmoil brewing inside me. He was more perceptive than people gave him credit for, and I caught him watching me closely, his bright eyes filled with curiosity. "You're too smart for your own good," I said to him with a forced smile, trying to lighten the moment. He grinned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he sensed something was off. Victor stayed out of the way for most of the day, but every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of him in the hall or hear his voice in another room. Each time, my chest tightened, the memory of his touch and his words flooding back with an intensity that left me breathless. That evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Victor found me in the living room. I was tidying up, trying to keep my hands busy, when he entered. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his presence filling the room, before stepping closer. "Barbara," he said softly, his tone cautious. "We can't ignore this." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know what to do." His eyes searched mine, his expression filled with a mix of longing and determination. "We figure it out together," he said. Whatever it takes. What about Evelyn? I asked, the question breaking the fragile moment. What about your marriage? His jaw tightened, and he looked away. Evelyn and our marriage has been a formality for years. She spends most of her time traveling or attending events. We're polite to each other, but that's all it is, politeness. That doesn't make this right, I said, tears stinging my eyes. We're lying to her. To Daniel. I know, he said, his voice breaking. And I hate it. But I can't pretend I don't feel what I feel for you. The conversation ended without resolution, and I left the manor that night feeling more conflicted than ever. Victor's words echoed in my mind, his admission about his marriage, both a justification and a weight that I couldn't carry alone. The following week, Evelyn returned from one of her trips. Her presence shifted the dynamic in the house, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floors as she moved through the rooms with an air of effortless elegance. She greeted me politely, but with a distance that made it clear I was just another employee in her eyes. Watching her interact with Victor was painful. Their exchanges were cold, perfunctory, and I could see the truth in what he had said about their marriage. But that didn't make what we had done any easier to bear. One afternoon, as I helped Daniel with his therapy, Evelyn entered the room. She stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable as she watched us. You're good with him, she said finally, her tone almost grudging. Better than most. Thank you, I said softly, my nerves on edge. She nodded, lingering for a moment before leaving without another word. The encounter left me shaken, the weight of her presence a stark reminder of the line I had crossed. Victor found me in the garden later that day, his expression grim. Evelyn suspects something, he said quietly. My heart dropped. How do you know? She asked me about you, he said, his voice steady. Why I hired you, why I seem different when you're around. What did you say? I asked, panic rising in my chest. I told her the truth, he said. That you've been a godsend for Daniel. And for me. The days that followed were fraught with tension, every interaction with Evelyn laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and the fear of what would happen next consumed me. But even as the storm loomed on the horizon, I couldn't bring myself to walk away from Victor. The pull of him was too strong, the connection we shared too real, to deny. And though I didn't know how it would all end, I knew one thing for certain, there was no turning back. The air in the manor grew heavier with each passing day. Evelyn's presence was like a storm cloud, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Though she didn't confront me directly, her icy demeanor and clipped remarks made it clear that she suspected something. Every encounter with her left me on edge, my nerves fraying with the weight of what I couldn't say. Victor, too, seemed strained. He tried to maintain his usual composure, but there were moments when his mask slipped, revealing the turmoil beneath. We spoke only in passing, our conversations careful and brief. But even in the silence, the connection between us simmered, undeniable and impossible to ignore. One evening, after Daniel had gone to bed, Evelyn approached me in the kitchen. I was tidying up, my hands trembling as I wiped down the counter, when her voice cut through the quiet. Barbara, she said, her tone deceptively casual. You've been here a while now. Yes, Mrs. Renault, I said, forcing a smile. It's been a privilege to care for Daniel. She nodded, her gaze sharp as it settled on me. He seems to like you. Victor does too, from what I've noticed. My heart stopped, and I turned away, pretending to adjust the kettle. I hope I've been able to make a positive difference, I said, my voice steady, despite the panic rising in my chest. Evelyn stepped closer, her presence looming. You've done more than that, she said softly, her voice laced with something I couldn't quite place. But let me give you a word of advice, Barbara. Don't overstep. People in your position often confuse gratitude with something else entirely. Her words were like a slap, and I felt my face flush with a mix of shame and anger. I understand, I said quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the counter. Good, she said, her tone cool as she turned and left the room. I sat in the kitchen long after she was gone, my hands trembling as I replayed her words. She knew, or at least, she suspected, and the realization sent a wave of panic through me. I couldn't stay. Not like this. The tension was unbearable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The next morning, I decided to hand in my notice. As much as it pained me to leave Daniel, I couldn't bear the thought of being the reason his family unraveled. I wrote a brief letter of resignation and folded it neatly, my heart heavy as I prepared to give it to Victor. When I found him in his study, he looked up from his desk, his expression softening when he saw me. "Barbara," he said, his tone warm. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated, clutching the letter in my hands. "Victor, I need to speak with you." He stood, concern flickering in his eyes. "What's wrong?" "I can't stay," I said, my voice trembling. Whatever this is between us, it's too much. Evelyn knows. Or at least she suspects. And I can't be the reason your family falls apart." Victor's jaw tightened, and he stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You're not the reason, Barbara. My marriage has been broken for years. Evelyn and there's nothing left between us." "That doesn't make this right," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "I can't live with the guilt. And I can't hurt Daniel like this." "You're not hurting him," Victor said firmly. "You've been the best thing to happen to him, and to me." His words broke something inside me, and I shook my head, the tears spilling over. "I care about you, Victor. More than I should. But this isn't just about us." Before he could respond, the door swung open, and Evelyn stepped inside. Her expression was icy, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I see I wasn't imagining things." "Evelyn," Victor began, his tone measured. "This isn't the time." "This is exactly the time," she snapped, her gaze shifting to me. "How dare you? You come into my home, pretending to care about my son, and all the while, you're sneaking around with my husband?" My chest tightened, and I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The shame and guilt I had been carrying finally erupted, leaving me frozen. "This isn't Barbara's fault," Victor said, stepping in front of me. "If you want to blame someone, blame me." "Oh, don't worry," Evelyn said, her tone venomous. "There's plenty of blame to go around." The confrontation was brutal, Evelyn's accusations cutting deep as Victor tried to defend me. But no matter what he said, the damage was done. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the fallout was as devastating as I had feared. By the time I left the manor that evening, my heart felt like it had been torn in two. I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel, about how this would affect him, and about the mess I had created. But even in the midst of my guilt and regret, I couldn't deny the pull I still felt toward Victor. Leaving the manor that evening felt like stepping away from a battlefield, the weight of Evelyn's accusations pressing heavily on my chest. The confrontation had left me shaken, her words echoing in my mind as I drove home in silence. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that perhaps she was right, not about my intentions with Daniel, but about what I had allowed to happen with Victor. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the resignation letter I hadn't given Victor. My hands trembled as I replayed the events of the previous evening. Evelyn's anger had been fierce, but beneath it was something more painful, the quiet acknowledgement of betrayal. I didn't know if I had the strength to face her, or Victor, or Daniel. My phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. It was Victor. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call, but something in me couldn't let it go to voicemail. "Barbara," he said when I answered, his voice quiet but firm. "Are you all right?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Victor, I can't go back there. Not after what happened." "You don't have to decide that right now," he said gently. "But I need you to know, I meant what I said. You've done nothing wrong." I let out a bitter laugh, tears welling in my eyes. That's not how it feels, Victor. Evelyn. Evelyn's anger isn't about you, he interrupted. It's about us. About a marriage that ended long before you came into our lives. For the next few days, I stayed away from the matter. I told myself I needed time to think, but the truth was, I didn't know how to face the fallout of my choices. I missed Daniel terribly, his laughter and curiosity a bright spot in my otherwise lonely days. But even the thought of seeing him brought a wave of guilt that I couldn't shake. Victor called often, his voice a mix of concern and determination. He told me about the conversations he was having with Evelyn, about the decision he had made to end their marriage. This isn't about us, Barbara, he said during one call. It's about being honest, for once in my life, with everyone involved. His words were sincere, but they didn't ease my doubts. And what about Daniel? I asked softly. How do we explain this to him? Victor was silent for a moment before replying, with care. With honesty. He deserves that. When I finally returned to the matter, it was under the pretense of retrieving my belongings. Evelyn was out, and the house felt quieter than I remembered, the usual warmth of Daniel's laughter conspicuously absent. Victor met me in the kitchen, his expression filled with relief and something deeper, gratitude, perhaps, or hope. You didn't have to come, he said softly. I needed to, I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. For Daniel. For closure. He nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. But as I gathered my things, the memories of my time there washed over me, each one more bittersweet than the last. When I finished, I found myself standing in Daniel's room, watching him sleep, his breathing soft and even. Victor joined me there, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. He's missed you, he said, his voice low. I've missed him too, I admitted, my throat tightening. More than I thought possible. You've made a difference in his life, Barbara, Victor said, his tone filled with conviction. And in mine. His words sent a shiver through me, and I turned to face him, my emotions threatening to spill over. Victor, I don't know if I can do this. The guilt, the questions, it's too much. He stepped closer, his gaze steady and unwavering. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, he said. But I need you to know that I'm not giving up on us. As I drove home that evening, I felt a strange mix of clarity and uncertainty. I couldn't deny what I felt for Victor, but I also couldn't ignore the toll it was taking on everyone involved. The road ahead felt impossibly uncertain, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to navigate it. But one thing was clear, I couldn't walk away from Daniel, from the connection we had built, or from the man who had reignited something in me I thought I had lost forever. The decision to return to the manor wasn't an easy one. I spent days grappling with my emotions, weighing the guilt against the undeniable pull I felt toward Victor and Daniel. In the end, it was Daniel who tipped the scales. I couldn't leave him, not after the bond we'd built, not when I knew how much he needed someone who truly saw him. When I arrived at the manor, it felt different, quieter somehow. Evelyn's car was absent from the driveway, and Victor was waiting by the door. His expression was cautious but warm, and I felt a flicker of relief at the sight of him. Barbara, he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. Thank you for coming back. I'm here for Daniel, I said quickly, though my voice lacked conviction. He nodded, his eyes searching mine. Of course. Daniel's face lit up when I entered his room, and the joy in his expression made my chest ache. He reached for my hand, his movements slow but deliberate, and I felt tears prick my eyes as I took it. Hello, Daniel, I said softly. I missed you. He grinned, a soundless laugh escaping him as he squeezed my hand. The connection between us was as strong as ever, and in that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. Evelyn returned later that evening, her presence as sharp and commanding as ever. She didn't speak to me directly, but her icy glances were enough to make her feelings clear. The tension in the house was palpable, and I did my best to keep to the background, focusing all my energy on Daniel. Victor, however, refused to let the situation fester. That night, after dinner, he called Evelyn into the study, his tone firm but calm. I couldn't hear their conversation, but the muffled sound of raised voices was impossible to ignore. When Victor emerged an hour later, his expression was a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He found me in the kitchen, where I was cleaning up, and leaned against the doorway. "It's done," he said quietly. "What's done?" I asked, though I already knew. "I told her I want a divorce," he said, his voice steady. "It's been a long time coming, and it's the right thing for everyone." His words left me reeling. I had expected this moment to feel triumphant, a resolution to the turmoil of the past weeks. But instead, I felt a deep unease. Evelyn's anger was justified, and the thought of Daniel being caught in the crossfire filled me with guilt. "Victor," I began, but he held up a hand. "She'll be leaving in the next few weeks," he said. "She's agreed to keep things civil for Daniel's sake, and I'll make sure he understands this isn't his fault." The conviction in his voice was reassuring, but it didn't ease the knot in my chest. "I don't want to be the reason your family falls apart," I said softly. "You're not," he said firmly. "This isn't about you, Barbara. This is about a marriage that ended long before you came into our lives." The next few weeks were fraught with tension. Evelyn began packing her things, her presence in the house becoming increasingly scarce. When we did cross paths, her demeanor was cold but restrained, as though she had resigned herself to the situation. Daniel, ever perceptive, sensed the shift in the household. He grew quieter, more withdrawn, and it broke my heart to see him retreat into himself. I did everything I could to comfort him, but there were moments when his sadness was almost too much to bear. One evening, as I sat with Daniel in the living room, Victor joined us, his expression heavy. "I think it's time we talked to him," he said quietly. I nodded, my stomach twisting with anxiety. "What will you tell him?" "The truth," Victor said simply. "That his mother and I are separating, but that we both love him and that it's not his fault." We sat with Daniel together, Victor explaining the situation in careful, measured tones. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently as Victor reassured him that he would always have our love and support. The conversation was difficult, but it brought a sense of relief, an acknowledgement of the truth that had been hovering over us for too long. As Daniel rested his head against my shoulder, his small hand still gripping mine, I felt a surge of protectiveness wash over me. I had come back for him, and I wouldn't leave his side now. That night, Victor and I sat together in the garden, the air cool and still. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For being here. For standing by him. And by me." "I don't know if I deserve that, thanks," I said softly, my gaze fixed on the stars. "This hasn't been easy." "No, it hasn't," he admitted. "But I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As I rested my head against his shoulder, the weight of the past weeks began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of possibility. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could navigate it together. The days following Evelyn's departure were quieter than I had expected. She left with little fanfare, her sharp heels clicking down the marble steps one final time as the movers loaded her belongings into a sleek black car. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no parting words filled with venom or regret, just the weight of her absence hanging in the air like a storm that had passed, leaving a strange stillness in its wake. Daniel seemed to sense the shift. For the first few days, he was unusually quiet, his bright eyes dull as he watched the world move around him. I spent hours sitting with him, telling stories, singing softly, and doing everything I could to coax a smile back to his face. Victor joined us often, his attempts to comfort Daniel both tender and awkward, as though he was unsure how to fill the space Evelyn had left behind. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Daniel finally broke his silence. He reached for Victor's hand, his fingers curling tightly around his father's, and looked at me with an expression that made my chest ache. "You're going to be okay," I said softly, leaning forward to brush his hair back. "We're all going to be okay. I promise." Victor's gaze met mine over Daniel's head, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "Together." Adjusting to life without Evelyn was a process. The house, once filled with her presence, felt larger and quieter, and I often caught Victor staring into the distance, lost in thought. He never spoke ill of her, never expressed anger or resentment, but there was a sadness in him that he couldn't quite hide. "She wasn't always like this," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "When we first married, she was full of life. But somewhere along the way, we lost each other." "I'm sorry," I said, my voice gentle. "For both of you." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's not her fault. And it's not mine. We just weren't meant to last." As the weeks passed, Victor and I began to navigate the new dynamic between us. Our relationship, once shrouded in secrecy and tension, began to take on a sense of clarity. We were no longer hiding, no longer tiptoeing around the truth. But with that openness came a new set of challenges. Every decision felt weighted, every interaction tinged with the knowledge of how fragile this new reality was. I worried constantly about how Daniel would perceive us, about whether I could truly fill the void left by his mother. Victor, for his part, was patient, his steady presence grounding me even as my doubts threatened to overwhelm me. One afternoon, as I helped Daniel with his stretching exercises, he looked at me with a solemn expression that made my heart skip a beat. He pointed to me, then to Victor, and raised his eyebrows in a silent question. My hands froze, and I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. "Daniel," I began, my voice trembling, "your father and I care about each other. Very much. But if you're ever uncomfortable, if you ever feel like this isn't what you want, you can tell us. Always." He studied me for a long moment before breaking into a small, mischievous grin. Then he reached for my hand and squeezed it, his way of saying he understood, or at least, that he was willing to try. That evening, I told Victor about the conversation, my voice tinged with both relief and uncertainty. "He didn't seem upset," I said. "But I don't know if he fully understands." "He's smarter than we give him credit for," Victor replied, his tone thoughtful. "And he trusts you. That means everything." I nodded, my chest tightening with emotion. "I just want to do right by him." "You already have," Victor said, reaching for my hand. "You're more than I ever could have hoped for." For him. For me. As the days turned into weeks, the three of us began to find a rhythm. We took day trips to the park, watched movies in the evenings, and even started a small garden in the backyard, Daniel laughing as Victor and I bickered over where to plant the roses. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like something solid, something real. But even as I began to settle into this new life, a question lingered at the edges of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. It was a question I couldn't ignore, one that gnawed at me in the quiet moments when I was alone. Was it Victor the first had fallen for? Or was it the chance to care for Daniel, to be needed again, that had drawn me in? The life we were building felt like a fragile masterpiece, delicate, imperfect, but beautiful in its way. Victor and I had settled into a rhythm that felt natural, and Daniel, ever perceptive, seemed to accept the shift in dynamics with a grace that surprised me. The days passed in a quiet blur of laughter, work, and stolen moments that felt like stolen treasures. But in the quiet of the nights, when the house was silent and my thoughts were louder than ever, the question still haunted me. Was my love for Victor real, or was it tied to the life I had built with Daniel? I didn't know how to separate the two, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. One evening, as Victor and I sat in the living room after putting Daniel to bed, he turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You've been quiet lately," he said gently. "Is something on your mind?" I hesitated, my hands tightening around the mug of tea in my lap. "I've just been thinking," I said softly. "About us. About what this all means." He nodded, his gaze steady. "I've been thinking about that too." The admission surprised me, and I looked at him more closely. "You have?" "Of course," he said, his voice warm. "This hasn't been easy, for any of us. But I know one thing for certain, Barbara. I've never been more sure of anything in my life than I am about you." His words sent a shiver through me, and I felt tears prick my eyes. "Victor, I care about you deeply," I said, my voice trembling. "But sometimes I wonder if what we have is real, or if it's just circumstantial." He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. The questions lingered, but for the first time I allowed myself to believe that the answers might not define us. What mattered was the life we were building, the love we were nurturing, and the future we were beginning to embrace. Over the next few weeks, we began to make plans for the future. Victor spoke openly about his intentions to finalize the divorce, to make our relationship official, and to ensure Daniel's happiness above all else. His certainty was comforting, and I found myself leaning into the possibilities he presented. "We could travel," he said one afternoon as we worked in the garden. "Show Daniel the world. He's never been to the coast, I think he'd love the ocean." The thought of Daniel experiencing the salty breeze and crashing waves brought a smile to my face. "That sounds wonderful," I said softly. "I'd love that." "And I'd love to give that to him," Victor said, his gaze lingering on mine. "With you by my side." But even as the future began to take shape, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was unresolved. It wasn't until one quiet evening, as I sat by Daniel's bedside, that the realization hit me: my love for Victor and my bond with Daniel weren't separate at all. They were two parts of the same truth, intertwined in ways I could never untangle. Daniel stirred, his bright eyes opening to meet mine. He smiled, his hand reaching for mine, and I felt the familiar warmth of his trust and affection. In that moment, I understood that my love for him had opened my heart in ways I hadn't thought possible, and that love had made room for Victor, too. When I returned to the living room, Victor was waiting for me, his expression filled with quiet anticipation. "How is he?" he asked. "Perfect," I said softly, sinking into the seat beside him. We sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the past months beginning to lift. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, not because the questions had been answered, but because I no longer needed them to be. The weeks that followed were marked by a quiet transformation, a steady unfolding of a new chapter in our lives. The house no longer felt like a place of tension or secrets, it was becoming a home. The laughter of Daniel, the soft hum of Victor's voice as he read aloud, the clink of cups in the kitchen, all of it wove together into a life that felt both fragile and fiercely alive. Evelyn's absence, though still palpable, began to fade into the background. Victor handled the divorce proceedings with a calm resolve, his focus unwavering. "This is for the best," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch. "For her, for Daniel, for all of us." I nodded, though I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for Evelyn. She had been a part of this family long before me, and I couldn't pretend that my presence hadn't hastened her departure. Still, I clung to the hope that in time, she would find her own peace, and that we might all move forward without resentment. Victor proposed on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air was sharp and the leaves scattered like gold across the ground. We had taken Daniel to the park, his wheelchair gliding along the winding paths as he laughed at the sight of dogs chasing each other through the fallen leaves. As we paused by the lake, Victor turned to me, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took my breath away. "Barbara," he said softly, taking my hands in his. "You've given me more than I ever thought I deserved. More than I ever thought was possible. I can't imagine my life without you." Tears welled in my eyes as he knelt, a small box appearing in his hands. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with hope. I glanced at Daniel, who was watching us with wide eyes and an excited grin, then back at Victor. The answer came easily, a quiet yes escaping my lips as tears slid down my cheeks. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the garden of the manor with only a handful of close friends and family. Daniel sat proudly by Victor's side, his smile brighter than I had ever seen it, and when Victor placed the ring on my finger, I felt a warmth flood through me that I hadn't known was possible. Life as Victor's wife and Daniel's stepmother was both a joy and a challenge. There were days when the weight of my responsibilities felt overwhelming, when the memories of how we had come together threatened to cast a shadow over our happiness. But those moments were fleeting, drowned out by the laughter we shared, the quiet nights spent together, and the small victories that made everything worth it. Daniel thrived in the new stability of our family, his confidence growing with each passing day. He took pride in calling me Mum, though he still reserved Dad for Victor, a distinction I respected deeply. Watching him flourish, knowing I had played a part in his happiness, filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. But even in the midst of this new life, the question lingered, the one I had never fully confronted. It wasn't about Victor's love for me, or my place in Daniel's life. It was about the truth of my own heart. One evening, as I lay beside Victor, my head resting on his chest, the thought surfaced again, unbidden but insistent, was it him I had fallen for? Or was it the chance to care for Daniel, to fill the emptiness left by Harold's death, that had drawn me in? I shifted slightly, and Victor's hand moved to rest on my back, his touch steady and comforting. "You're quiet tonight," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Just thinking," I replied, my voice soft. "Good thoughts, I hope," he said, his tone teasing. I smiled, closing my eyes as his heartbeat echoed in my ear. "Good enough," I said, though the question still lingered at the edges of my mind, unresolved. As sleep began to pull me under, I realized that perhaps the answer didn't matter. Whether it was Victor, Daniel, or the life we had built together, what mattered was that I had found a place where I belonged. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.